My son saved his lunch money for 3 weeks to take me out for my birthday. 7 years old. 3 weeks of eating whatever they put on the tray at school, stuffing quarters into an envelope he hid under his pillow, counting them every night before he went to sleep. He told me in the car on the way there, bouncing in the back seat, so proud he could barely hold it in. "I got enough, Mama." I counted twice. We walked into that diner in our best clothes, which weren't much. But they were clean, and they were ours, and Tyler put that envelope on the table between us like he was laying down something sacred. 11 minutes. That's how long it lasted before Victoria Harmon looked at my son, like he was something that didn't belong in her air. I won't give her more words than she deserves. I'll just say she made sure everyone in that restaurant heard her, and when I stood up, when I had the nerve to stand up, she hit me across the face in front of my child. Tyler didn't cry. He went completely still, and he looked at me, and in his eyes was the question every child eventually asks the world. "Is this what you are?" We were still standing on the sidewalk, his hand in mine, when 3 Rolls Royces pulled up to the curb. The man who stepped out of the first one looked across the street, saw my face, and stopped walking like the ground had shifted under him. He said my name, not like a question, like he'd been carrying it a long time and had finally found the place to set it down. And if you've ever stood on a sidewalk holding your child's hand, trying to explain something the world should never have made you explain, you already know this story isn't over. Stay with me, subscribe if you're new, and tell me where you're watching from, because I read every single comment. Before I tell you what happened inside that diner, you need to understand what it took just to get there. I work the night shift at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. 3 nights a week, sometimes 4 when someone calls out, and I pick up the extra hours because extra hours mean extra money, and extra money means Tyler gets his field trip paid on time and the electricity stays on, and there's still something left at the end of the month that doesn't immediately disappear into the next bill. I've been doing this for 6 years. Since Tyler's father left, not dramatically, not with a fight, just quietly. One Tuesday, like a man who'd decided the weight of a family was something he could set down and walk away from, and did. I didn't chase him. I didn't beg. I had a 4-month-old son in a second-hand crib and a nursing license, and the particular furious clarity that comes when someone leaves you with no option except to be stronger than you thought you were. So I got strong. Not the kind of strong people celebrate. Not the Instagram kind, not the kind that gets you a profile feature in a magazine. The invisible kind, the kind that looks like just a tired woman in scrubs at 7 a.m., loading a sleeping child into a car seat, driving home on fumes, sleeping 3 hours, getting up to make breakfast and pack a lunch and walk Tyler to the bus stop before going back to bed for 2 more hours before the whole thing starts again. We live in a 2-bedroom apartment in a part of Nashville that used to be considered rough and is now being called transitional by people who mean something specific by that word and don't particularly care what it costs the people who already live there. Our apartment is clean. It's small. Tyler has his own room because I sleep on a pullout in the living room, which he doesn't know, because I've arranged things so he doesn't have to know. He's a good kid. I want to say that simply because I think parents sometimes oversell their children, and I'm not trying to do that. I just want you to understand who Tyler actually is, because it matters to the rest of this story. He's curious, careful, pays attention to things adults don't expect children to notice. He asks good questions. He remembers things as I say, months after I've forgotten I said them. Last spring, his teacher called me to tell me Tyler had spent his recess helping a new kid figure out the lunch line, and I sat in the break room at work and cried for 5 minutes because I hadn't taught him that specifically, which meant he'd arrived at it himself. He's 7 years old and he already understands in the way children understand things before they have the words for them, that our life requires a certain kind of care. He turns off lights when he leaves rooms. He tells me without being asked when he's outgrown something, so I have time to find a replacement before it becomes urgent. Last Christmas, he asked for exactly 2 things: a library card and a particular book he'd seen at school, and when I asked if there was anything else, he said, "That's enough, Mama." I don't need a lot. I don't know how to explain what it does to you, raising a child like that. The pride in it and the ache in it, both at once. His birthday is in March. He turned 7 this year on a Wednesday, which was one of my off nights, which felt like a gift from the universe since off nights don't always cooperate with birthdays. I'd been planning something small: his favorite dinner, a cake from the mix, the particular evening routine he loved most, which involved a board game and staying up an hour past bedtime. And then, 3 weeks before the day, he came home from school with the envelope. He'd gotten the idea himself, he explained, very seriously, sitting across from me at the kitchen table like a person presenting a business proposal. His school did a thing where kids could bring their own lunch money instead of using the cafeteria account, and if he brought his own peanut butter crackers from home, which he liked fine, he could save the cafeteria money instead. "I want to take you somewhere nice," he said, "for your birthday, because you always do stuff for mine." I looked at this 7-year-old person across my kitchen table, with his serious face and his envelope and his 3-week plan, and I thought, this is what it's for. Every night shift, every extra pickup, every month of invisible strength, it's for the person sitting across from me who came up with this on his own. "Okay," I told him. "Let's go somewhere nice." We chose a place called Rosewood Diner. Not a fancy restaurant, not the kind of place that requires reservations, but a step above our usual, with tablecloths and a menu that had more than 1 page and chicken and waffles that Tyler had decided, based on a picture he'd seen somewhere, was the thing he most wanted to eat in the world. He wore his church clothes. I wore the blue dress I keep for occasions that warrant it. Not new, not expensive, but clean and pressed and mine. We drove over on a Tuesday evening, parked 2 blocks away because parking closer cost money we didn't need to spend, walked to the entrance with his envelope in his hand and the particular brightness that children carry when they've worked towards something and are finally arriving at it. He held the door open for me. 7 years old in his church clothes, holding the door open for his mother at a restaurant he'd saved 3 weeks of lunch money to take her to, looking up at me with a smile that had no idea yet what the next 11 minutes were going to ask of it. I looked at my son in that doorway, and I thought, whatever else is true about my life, I did this right. We went inside. Victoria Harmon had been coming to Rosewood Diner every Tuesday evening for 11 years. I learned this afterward, the way you learn the details of something after it's already changed your life. In pieces, from different directions, each piece adding something to a picture you wish you'd had earlier. The owner told Marcus, who told someone, who eventually told me. 11 years, same corner booth, same order, same expectations about how the evening would go, and how the space around her would be organized to accommodate those expectations. She was the kind of regular that a certain kind of restaurant cultivates carefully. The kind whose approval means something in the circles that matter to that restaurant's reputation, whose dissatisfaction travels fast and costs more than her check is worth. Nashville's dining scene is not a large world, and Victoria Harmon moved through it the way people move through worlds they've decided belong to them. She arrived at 6:15, which was 15 minutes after Tyler and I sat down. I noticed her the way you notice a shift in a room's atmosphere before you've identified the source. A particular attention that moved with her from the door to her booth, a small reconfiguration of the staff's posture, the host's smile sharpening from genuine to professional in the way smiles do when someone important walks in. She was dressed the way women dressed when clothes were a form of communication rather than simply covering. Everything precisely chosen, nothing accidental. She carried herself with the ease of someone who had never, in recent memory, been made to wait for anything. I wasn't watching her, particularly. I was watching Tyler, who had opened his menu with both hands and was studying it with the focused intensity he brought to anything that required a decision, his lips moving slightly as he read. He'd already found the chicken and waffles. I could tell by the way his expression settled when he landed on the page, the small exhale of someone who has confirmed that the thing they'd hoped for is actually available. "It's real," he said, looking up at me. "It's actually on there. Did you think I made it up?" I asked. He considered this seriously. "No," he said, "but sometimes things are different in real life than in the picture." I thought about that for a moment. The particular wisdom of a 7-year-old who had learned, earlier than he should have had to, that things are not always what they appear to be in the picture. "Order it," I said. "It's your birthday dinner, too." He went back to the menu, satisfied, and I picked up my own, and for a few minutes the diner was simply a diner. Warm, slightly noisy, smelling of coffee and something frying. The particular comfort of a place that had been feeding people for years and knew how to do it. I became aware of Victoria Harmon looking at us somewhere around the 5-minute mark. Not a glance, a look. The sustained, appraising kind that's designed to be noticed, that carries its assessment in its duration. I've experienced versions of that look my entire life, and I've learned to read its specific registers. The curious kind, the hostile kind, the unconscious kind where the person doesn't realize they're doing it, and the deliberate kind where they very much do. This was the deliberate kind. She looked at Tyler's church clothes. Clean, pressed, slightly too small because children grow faster than budgets allow. She looked at my blue dress, which was clean and pressed, and not new and not expensive, and apparently communicated exactly what she needed it to communicate for her assessment to be complete. She looked at the envelope Tyler had placed on the table between us, which was a plain white business envelope with "Mama Birthday" written on it in his careful 7-year-old handwriting. I watched her look at that envelope, and I watched something settle in her expression that I recognized. The particular settling of a person who has placed you in a category and is now simply confirming the placement. I looked back down at my menu. I've spent my entire life making the choice I made in that moment. The choice not to meet that kind of look with the energy it wants from you, not to give it the confrontation that would justify itself, not to allow someone else's assessment of me to become the thing that defines the next hour of my life. It's a choice that costs something every time you make it, a small, specific expenditure of dignity that you make, because the alternative costs more. Tyler didn't notice. He was deep in a conversation with himself about whether to get the regular chicken and waffles or the spicy version, weighing the evidence carefully, not yet aware that the woman in the corner booth had already decided something about both of us. Our server came. A young woman named Kayla, warm and efficient, who took our order with the kind of genuine pleasantness that makes you feel seen rather than processed. Tyler ordered the spicy chicken and waffles, which he'd decided on with the gravity of someone making a significant commitment. I ordered the shrimp and grits because it was my birthday and I was allowed. We talked while we waited. About school, about a book he was reading, about a friend of his named Marcus, who had apparently done something hilarious at recess that required a detailed retelling. I listened to my son talk the way I always listened. Completely, the way you listen to something you know you'll want to remember. And the diner was warm, and the food was coming, and Tyler's envelope sat on the table between us like a small, handmade monument to the particular kind of love that counts quarters under a pillow for 3 weeks. I should have known, when things are exactly that good, to pay closer attention to what's sitting in the corner booth watching you enjoy them. The food arrived at 6:34. I know the exact time because Tyler checked his watch, a second-hand digital one he'd gotten for Christmas, which he wore with the seriousness of someone who'd only recently acquired the ability to tell time and intended to use it, and announced, with great satisfaction, that it had taken exactly 22 minutes, which he considered reasonable. The chicken and waffles were everything the picture had promised. I watched Tyler look at his plate the way children look at something they've anticipated for a long time and are now confronting in its full reality, and I watched the moment his expression resolved from anticipation into the particular, uncomplicated joy of a thing being exactly as good as you'd hoped. He picked up his fork. He looked at me. "Mama," he said, "this is a good birthday." "It is," I agreed. We ate. The shrimp and grits were excellent. Tyler worked through his chicken and waffles with the focused dedication of someone who understood he was having an experience worth paying attention to, occasionally looking up to share an observation. The syrup was different from the kind we had at home. The waffle had a crunch to it he hadn't expected. The spicy version was definitely the right call. I was watching him cut a particularly ambitious piece of waffle when it happened. He'd pushed his chair back slightly to reach across the table for the syrup pitcher, the small, unconscious movement of a child who hasn't yet fully calibrated the geometry of his own body relative to the space around him. And the back of his chair made contact with something behind him. Not a collision, a graze. The gentle, accidental brush of a 7-year-old's chair against the edge of the booth behind us, where Victoria Harmon had apparently shifted closer to our table than I'd realized. I heard the small sound of liquid moving, a glass tipping. Not breaking. Just the soft, contained sound of water hitting a tablecloth rather than a floor, the kind of minor mishap that happens in restaurants a dozen times a night and is handled by a server with a cloth napkin and an apology before anyone's evening is meaningfully interrupted. Tyler froze. He looked back, saw what had happened, and did exactly what I'd raised him to do. Turned around fully, looked directly at the woman in the booth, and said, clearly and sincerely, "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to. 7 years old. Church clothes. Sincere apology. Eye contact. I've replayed what happened next more times than I can count, and I still don't have a framework for it that makes sense. Because the thing about that kind of cruelty is that it doesn't require a framework. It just requires a person who has decided, in that particular moment, that the rules of basic human decency don't apply to the people in front of her." Victoria Harmon looked at my son. Then she looked at me. And then she said, loudly enough that the tables around us went quiet, exactly what she thought of us, of our clothes, of our presence in her diner on her Tuesday evening, of the envelope on our table, and what it represented about the kind of people she'd been forced to share a room with. I won't repeat the specific words. I'll tell you they were chosen carefully and delivered with the confidence of a woman who had never, in recent memory, experienced a consequence for anything she said to anyone she decided was beneath her. I stood up. I want to be honest about why. Not because I had a plan. Not because I'd calculated the right response, but because something in me that had been making the choice to sit down and look away my entire life simply, in that moment, declined to make that choice again. I stood up, and I looked at her, and I said, quietly and directly, that what she'd said was not acceptable, and that my son had apologized, and that was the end of it. She hit me. I need you to understand the specific geography of that moment. Tyler was sitting 2 feet to my left. He was 7 years old, in the church clothes he'd chosen himself, because we were going somewhere nice, with the birthday envelope still on the table in front of him. He had just watched his mother stand up for him, and now he was watching something happen that no child should ever have to watch happen to their mother. The sound of it was very loud in the quiet that had fallen over the restaurant. I didn't fall. I want to say that simply. I didn't fall, I didn't cry, I stood exactly where I was and looked at her and felt. Underneath the shock and the pain and the particular humiliation of being struck in public, something clarify in me that I don't know how to describe except as a kind of absolute bone-deep certainty about exactly what kind of person was standing in front of me. She told us to get out. The manager. A man whose expression told me he understood exactly what had just happened and was too frightened of Victoria Harmon to do anything useful about it, came and stood nearby without intervening, which was its own kind of answer about the specific geography of power in that room. I picked up Tyler's envelope. I took my son's hand. I walked us out of that restaurant with my back straight and my chin level, and Tyler's hand in mine. Not because I felt any of those things, but because my son was watching me, and I was not going to let him see me be anything other than upright. We stood on the sidewalk outside. The evening air was cool, the way Nashville evenings are in March. Tyler stood next to me, his hand still in mine, and he looked up at me with those eyes, the ones that see everything, the ones that had been watching me navigate the world his entire life, learning from the watching what kind of person it was possible to be. He didn't cry. He didn't ask me what had happened or why. He just looked at me for a long moment in the particular way of a child absorbing something enormous, and then he said, very quietly, "Are you okay, Mama?" I looked down at my son, 7 years old, chicken and waffles unfinished inside, 3 weeks of saved lunch money in a plain white envelope in my hand, and I opened my mouth to say, yes, I'm fine, the way I always said yes, I'm fine, the way I'd been saying yes. I'm fine for 6 years because that was what the situation required. And that was the moment 3 black Rolls Royces turned onto the street and pulled to the curb in front of us, one after another, so quiet and so deliberate that for a second neither of us moved. The door of the first one opened. A man stepped out, tall, well-dressed, somewhere in his 50s, and he looked across the roof of the car, and his eyes found my face, and he went completely still. "Sandra?" he said. Not a question. The way you say a name when you've been looking for the person it belongs to, and have finally, after a long time of looking, found them. Tyler looked up at me. I looked at the man across the car, and somewhere in the restaurant behind us, through the glass, Victoria Harmon was still at her booth, completely unaware that the 3 cars now parked at her curb had just made her Tuesday evening considerably more complicated than she'd planned. Glutnon, his name was David Harmon. I didn't know that yet, standing on the sidewalk with Tyler's hand in mine, and my cheek still stinging, and the evening air doing nothing useful about any of it. I only knew that a man I'd never seen before had said my name with the particular certainty of someone who had been carrying it for a while, and that 2 more car doors had opened behind him, and that 3 men in expensive suits were now standing on the sidewalk looking at me like I was something they'd been searching for, and had finally, unexpectedly, found. Tyler pressed closer to my side. I put my arm around him without looking down, the automatic geometry of a mother and child who've learned to move together. "Sandra Mills?" the man said again, coming around the front of the car now, moving carefully, the way you move towards something you're afraid of startling. "Sandra Mills, born Nashville, Tennessee, daughter of Louise Mills?" My mother's name in a stranger's mouth stopped me completely. "Who are you?" I said. He stopped a few feet away and looked at me. Really looked. The way people look when they're comparing something in front of them to something they've been carrying in their mind for a long time. His eyes moved to Tyler briefly, and something crossed his face that I couldn't read yet. "My name is David Harmon," he said. "My father was Harold Harmon Sr." He paused just long enough for the name to land. I think you may have known him." I hadn't known Harold Harmon Sr. I knew the name. Everyone in Nashville knew the name. The way everyone knows the names that are on buildings and hospital wings, and the sides of things that cost a great deal to build. Harmon Industries. 3 generations of Tennessee money, old enough to have earned the particular gravity that comes when wealth has been in one place long enough to seem like a permanent feature of the landscape. I'd never met the man. I had absolutely no idea why his son was standing on a sidewalk saying my mother's name. "I didn't know your father," I said carefully. "No," David said, "but he knew about you." Another pause. "He knew about you for a long time, Sandra. We've been trying to find you for 3 months." Behind him, the other 2 men had come to stand a few feet back. His brothers. I would later understand, though I didn't know that yet either. They were quiet, letting David handle whatever this was, watching me with the same careful, searching quality he had. Tyler tugged my hand. I looked down at him. "Mama," he said quietly, "why does that man know your name?" It was, I thought, exactly the right question, delivered with exactly the directness that had always been his particular gift. "I don't know yet, baby," I said honestly. "We're going to find out." I looked back at David Harmon, and something in my expression must have communicated what I needed, because he glanced at Tyler and then back at me and made a decision I could seize him make. To say the thing that needed saying, clearly, even though this sidewalk in front of this diner was not the place he'd imagined saying it. "My father had a relationship before he met my mother," he said. "A long time ago. He was young. The circumstances were complicated in the way things were complicated in this city in those years, and he made choices he spent the rest of his life not being able to fully make right." He looked at me steadily. He left her when she told him she was pregnant. Her name was Louise Mills. And he spent 40 years knowing he had a daughter he'd never met, and not knowing how to find her, and then not knowing how to reach out even when he could have, because by then too much time had passed and he was a coward about it in the specific way of men who've done something they can't undo and learn to live with the not undoing. The sidewalk was very still. Somewhere down the block, a car passed. Tyler was absolutely motionless against my side. "He got sick," David continued, "about a year before he died. And when he understood that he was running out of time, he did the thing he should have done 40 years earlier. He told us. He told us everything. He had a daughter. Her name was Sandra. Her mother was Louise Mills, who had passed away 6 years ago, and Sandra was a nurse in Nashville, and she was raising a son alone, and he wanted us to find her." His voice had something in it now that hadn't been there at the start. Not quite steady, working to stay that way. "He made us promise. He made us promise we'd find you, and that we'd make sure you knew, that he knew, that he'd always known, and that he was sorry." I stood on that sidewalk and felt the specific, enormous weight of what he'd just said settle into my body the way enormous things settle. Not all at once, not cleanly, but in layers, each one heavier than the last. My mother had raised me alone. I'd grown up knowing my father was absent in the particular way that meant permanently, completely, chosen. Not dead, not unable, just gone. She'd never told me his name. I'd stopped asking when I was old enough to understand that the asking cost her something she couldn't afford to keep paying, and I'd built my life on the foundation of what she'd given me instead, which had been considerable, which had been everything, which had been enough. And now a man with his father's last name was standing on a Nashville sidewalk, telling me that the absent, chosen, permanently gone had had a name and a face and a family and had known about me for 40 years and had died 3 months ago, having never once picked up the phone. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Tyler looked up at me. "Mama," he said, very quietly, "are you crying?" I hadn't known I was until he said it. I put my hand to my face and my fingers came away wet, and I looked at them with a kind of distant surprise. The way you're surprised by things your body does before your mind has caught up. Yeah, baby, I said. A little bit. He thought about this. Then he reached up and took my hand, both hands around one of mine, the way he'd held my hand when he was very small, and we walked through parking lots, and he just held it without saying anything else, because he was 7 years old and somehow already understood that some moments don't need words, they just need someone to hold on. David Harmon watched this, and I saw something move across his face that was, I thought, genuine. Not performance, not the managed emotion of a man delivering a difficult message, but the real thing, the specific expression of someone witnessing something that cost them something to witness. There's more, he said quietly. When you're ready. Not tonight, if tonight is too much. There's no rush, Sandra. We're not going anywhere. But there's a will, and there are things our Father left that belong to you legally as well as otherwise. And we want, he stopped, restarted. I want you to know that we're not here because of what the will says. My brothers and I talked about this a long time, before we went looking. We would have come regardless. He asked us to find his daughter. That's what we were doing. I looked at this man, this stranger with his father's last name and 3 months of searching and his father's 40-year apology delivered on a Nashville sidewalk in front of a diner, where, 6 minutes ago, someone had decided I didn't belong. Your father's name was Harold? I said. Harold James Harmon Sr., David said. He was stubborn and difficult and brilliant, and he made one mistake 40 years ago that he never recovered from making. A pause. He would have liked you. I think he did like you, in the way you can like the idea of someone you've never allowed yourself to actually know. I looked down at Tyler, who was watching David Harmon with the focused, evaluating attention he brought to anything new and significant. Tyler, I said, this man is going to explain something to us. It's going to take a while and it might be confusing. Is that okay? Tyler considered this with appropriate gravity. Are we still going to finish our dinner? He asked. Despite everything, despite my stinging cheek and my wet face, and the 40 years of absence that had just materialized on a sidewalk in the body of a man in a suit, I laughed. A real one, short and genuine, the kind that surprises you. Yes, I said. We're definitely going to finish our dinner. David Harmon looked at my son, and then at me, and something in his face settled into something warmer than it had been since he'd gotten out of the car. There's a restaurant 2 blocks from here, he said. Private room, no Tuesday regulars. Let us take you both to dinner. All of it, the conversation, the explanation, whatever questions you have. He paused. And the chicken and waffles, if that's what Tyler wants. We'll find chicken and waffles. Tyler looked up at me with the expression of a child who has just heard something that sounds, against all reasonable expectation, like it might be exactly right. I looked at my son, and at the envelope still in my hand, and at the 3 cars at the curb, and the 3 men on the sidewalk who had spent 3 months looking for me, because a dying man had finally decided to tell the truth about something he'd spent 40 years avoiding. Okay, I said. And we walked away from Rosewood Diner, Tyler's hand in mine, into whatever came next. The private room at the restaurant David chose was quiet in the particular way that expensive rooms are quiet, not empty, but deliberately insulated from the noise of everything outside it. The kind of quiet that costs money to maintain and communicates, without saying so, that whatever happens inside it is considered worth protecting. Tyler sat across from me with a menu he was studying with characteristic focus, apparently having decided, with the pragmatic adaptability of a 7-year-old, that the most reasonable response to an inexplicable evening was to identify the best available chicken and waffles and proceed from there. I watched him read and felt, underneath everything else I was feeling, the particular steadying effect he'd always had on me. His ordinariness, his appetite, his absolute refusal to be derailed by circumstances that hadn't yet been explained to him. David sat across from me. His brothers, Charles, 53, and Robert, 48, both with their father's eyes in the way David also had their father's eyes, which I was just beginning to understand meant something specific about what I was looking at, sat to either side, present but quiet, letting David lead the conversation the way they'd apparently agreed to before they'd gotten out of the cars. David set a folder on the table between us. He didn't open it immediately. "I want to tell you about my father first," he said, "before the legal part, because I think you deserve to know who he actually was before you decide what you want to do with anything else." I nodded, and he told me. Harold James Harmon Sr. had been born in Nashville in 1942, the third generation of a family that had built its money in manufacturing and expanded it into real estate and eventually into the broader, less easily categorized category that gets called simply industry when it's large enough. He'd grown up with the particular combination of privilege and expectation that shaped men of that background in that era. The assumption that his life had a shape, that the shape had already been decided, and that his job was to inhabit it correctly. He was 22 when he met my mother. She was 19, working at a diner, not Rosewood, a different one, long since gone, in a part of Nashville that Harold Harmon's life did not, by the logic of 1964, intersect with. He came in one afternoon with a friend, sat at the counter, and met Louise Mills, who was sharp and funny and beautiful, and entirely unimpressed by the Harmon name in the way that people who don't yet know the full weight of a name can be unimpressed by it. They saw each other for 8 months, secretly, in the specific way that things were done secretly in Nashville in 1964, when they involved a white man from a family like his and a black woman from a neighborhood like hers. David was careful with this part of the story, careful and specific, not softening it or dressing it up, saying plainly that what his father did was not brave, that he had known from the beginning that he was asking my mother to carry the larger share of the risk, and that he had done it anyway because he was 22 and selfish in the way of young men who want what they want without fully accounting for what it costs the other person to give it. When my mother told him she was pregnant, he left. Not immediately, not cleanly. David said his father had described it, in the conversations near the end of his life when he'd finally told his sons what he'd done, as a decision made by fear rather than cruelty. The fear of his family, of the consequences, of a life that deviated from the shape that had already been decided for him. He'd told himself, the way people tell themselves things that allow them to live with what they've done, that my mother would be fine, that she was strong, that she would manage. She was. She did. She managed completely, and she raised me alone, and she never once told me my father's name, and she died 6 years ago without ever having heard from him again. Harold Harmon married someone else the following year, a woman his family approved of, the right background, the right name, and had 3 sons, and built the Harmon Industries empire into something his grandfather couldn't have imagined, and lived, by every external measure, exactly the life that had been decided for him. And he never forgot my mother. And he never forgot me, though he'd never met me. David said his father had kept a photograph, not of my mother, he'd never had one, but of me, somehow, obtained in the way that people with significant resources can obtain things when they want to. A photograph of a woman named Sandra Mills, who worked nights at Vanderbilt Medical Center and was raising a son alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Nashville. He'd kept it in his desk drawer for 7 years, David said. Just kept it. Looked at it sometimes. Never did anything about it. He showed it to me 6 months before he died, David said. He'd been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and I think the diagnosis did what those diagnoses do. Made the things he'd been avoiding unavoidable. He looked at the folder on the table between us. He told me everything. He told all of us. And then he asked us to find you. I had been very still throughout all of this, listening in the complete way I'd learned to listen in 20 years of nursing. Taking in everything, cataloging it, holding it without immediately processing it, because processing would come later. And right now, the most important thing was to have the full picture before you began to make sense of it. Tyler had finished his survey of the menu and was now listening too, with the focused, careful attention of a child who understands that something important is being said even if he doesn't yet have the full context for it. The ADN test was my idea, David said. Before we approached you, I wanted to be certain. Not because I doubted what my father told us, but because I thought you deserved certainty. I thought you shouldn't have to take anyone's word for something like this. He slid an envelope across the table. We sent the testing company a DNA sample my father had provided before he died, specifically for this purpose. We would need your sample to complete the test, but the preliminary analysis of the paternal lineage markers is in there if you want to see it. I looked at the envelope. I didn't pick it up. He left a will, I said. It wasn't really a question. He left a will, David confirmed, updated 8 months before he died. Your name is in it, your full legal name, your date of birth, your mother's name. A pause. He left you an equal share, Sandra, equal to each of ours. The private room was very quiet. I understood in an abstract way what equal share of Harold Harmon Sr.'s estate meant in material terms. David had told me enough about his father for me to do that math without assistance. But the number was so far outside the geometry of my daily life, so far outside the world of night shifts and electricity bills and quarters in an envelope under a pillow, that it didn't land as a number. It landed as an idea, enormous and slightly unreal, like something you read about happening to someone else. Tyler was looking at me. "Mama," he said, "what does equal share mean?" I looked at my son, 7 years old, church clothes, birthday evening that had gone in a direction neither of us had anticipated, and I tried to find the version of the truth that was both honest and appropriate for a child to hold. "It means," I said carefully, "that someone left us something significant." Tyler thought about this. Like a gift? I looked at David Harmon across the table, at this man who had his father's eyes and had spent 3 months looking for me because a dying man had finally decided to tell the truth about a 22-year-old's fear that had shaped both of our lives in ways neither of us had chosen. "Something like that," I said. "A very late one." David looked at me, and I looked at him, and between us on the table was a folder and an envelope and 40 years of absence distilled into paperwork, which is what absence becomes eventually when the people who created it finally run out of time to keep not addressing it. "I need to think," I said. "Of course," David said immediately. "There's no urgency. The estate isn't going anywhere. We have an attorney whenever you're ready, and we'd like you to have your own representation. Independent counsel, someone who works for you, not for the estate. That's important to us." "Why?" I asked. "Why does that matter to you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because my father asked us to find his daughter," he said. "Not to find a legal situation to manage. His daughter. And daughters deserve people in their corner who are actually in their corner." He paused. "We want to know you, Sandra. All 3 of us. Not because of the will. We would have come regardless. I meant that on the sidewalk. We want to know our sister." The word landed differently than I expected it to. Not the legal concept, not the inheritance implication, just the word itself, plain and direct. Sister. I had grown up an only child. I had raised Tyler as an only child. I had built a life structured entirely around the 2 of us, tight and sufficient, and entirely self-contained, because that was what the available materials allowed. And now 3 men, with their father's eyes, were sitting across from me in a private room, telling me they wanted to know their sister. and my son was next to me eating the best chicken and waffles he'd ever had in his life. And somewhere across Nashville, Victoria Harmon was finishing her Tuesday evening at Rosewood Diner, completely unaware that the 3 cars she'd watched pull up to the curb had just rearranged the world of the woman she'd struck on the way out. I picked up the envelope with the DNA results. I held it for a moment without opening it. Then I set it back down and looked at David Harmon and said the only true thing I had available in that moment. "Tell me more about him," I said. "Your father. What was he actually like?" And David Harmon, who had spent 3 months looking for his sister and had found her on a sidewalk outside a diner on a Tuesday evening, settled back in his chair and began to talk about the man who had been, for both of us, a presence and an absence in equal complicated measure. Tyler ate his chicken and waffles. I listened, and outside, the Nashville evening moved through its ordinary business, entirely unaware of what was being rearranged inside a private room 2 blocks from Rosewood Diner. We didn't go back to Rosewood that night. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters to who I am in this story. I didn't march back through that door with 3 Harmon brothers behind me to make a point, didn't engineer a confrontation, didn't do any of the things that the version of this story where I'm performing righteous fury would require. I was too tired for fury that night. I had a 7-year-old son eating chicken and waffles across from me, and 40 years of my family's history being laid out on a table, and there was no space left for anything else. What happened at Rosewood happened without me. David told me about it later, matter-of-factly, the way he told me most things. Clearly, without embellishment, letting the facts do whatever work they were going to do. After dinner, after we'd talked for 2 hours, and Tyler had fallen asleep in the car on the way back to my apartment, David had asked if I minded if he and his brothers stopped back at Rosewood briefly. Not for me, he said, for themselves. Because they'd watched, from the cars, what had happened on that sidewalk before they'd gotten out, and there were things that needed to be said that didn't require my presence to be said correctly. I told him I didn't mind. Victoria Harmon was still there when they walked in. Same corner booth, same posture, the particular settled quality of a woman who'd had her Tuesday restored to its expected shape after a minor disruption, and was now finishing her evening the way she always finished it. She recognized David immediately. In Nashville's business circles, the Harmon name had a specific gravity, and David Harmon's face was attached to that name in ways that mattered to people like Victoria. Board memberships, charitable foundations, the particular social infrastructure of a city where old money and new money circulated in the same rooms, and everyone knew whose rooms they were. He didn't sit down. He stood at the edge of her booth, and his brothers stood behind him, and he said, in the quiet, direct voice that I would come to understand was simply how he talked when something mattered, "I need you to understand something about what happened here tonight." Victoria began to say something, the managed, reasonable version, the one she'd clearly already constructed in the hour since we'd left, and David said simply, "I watched it. From the car, I watched all of it. She stopped. The woman you struck," he said, "is my sister. I found out about her 3 months ago. My father spent 40 years knowing about her and not doing right by her, and I have spent 3 months trying to correct that, and I found her tonight, on that sidewalk, outside this restaurant, because of you." He paused. "I want you to understand that, not as a threat, as a fact. Whatever you believed you were dealing with when you looked at that woman and her son, you were dealing with a member of my family. And I take that seriously." Victoria said something about an accident, about a misunderstanding, about the boy's chair. "I'm not here to discuss the chair," David said. "I'm here because what you did was a crime, and because the woman you did it to has spent her entire life being treated as less than she is, and because I am not going to pretend I didn't see it, simply because saying something is inconvenient. He looked at her steadily. "My family's attorney will be in touch with you tomorrow. Not to negotiate, to inform you of your options. I'd suggest you have your own counsel available." He left without waiting for her response, the way people leave when they've said the thing they came to say and have no interest in the conversation that would follow it. That was how David Harmon described it to me. Clean, direct, no performance, just the facts of the situation laid out for a woman who had built her entire evening, and apparently her entire professional life, on the assumption that she could treat certain people in certain ways without consequence, because those people had no recourse. She was wrong about that. It turned out she'd been wrong about that for quite some time. The legal process that followed was, by the standards of these things, relatively swift. Victoria Harmon had, in front of a full restaurant of witnesses, committed an assault, the specific, documented, witnessed kind that doesn't require extensive investigation to establish. The Harmon family attorney filed the appropriate paperwork within 48 hours. 3 witnesses who'd been in Rosewood that evening came forward without being asked, including Kayla, our server, whose account was detailed and specific in the way of someone who'd been watching the situation carefully from the moment Victoria had looked at us across the room. Victoria's attorney made an initial attempt at the kind of managed resolution that money usually buys in situations like this: a quiet settlement, a confidentiality agreement, the disappearance of an incident into the legal mechanism designed to make incidents disappear. David's attorney declined on my behalf, clearly and without leaving room for negotiation, because David had asked me what I wanted, and I had told him honestly. I didn't want money from her. I wanted the thing that money is usually used to prevent: a record. An official, documented, publicly available acknowledgement that what happened on that sidewalk happened, that it was wrong, that it had consequences. That's what we got. The misdemeanor assault charge resulted in a conviction. Not a large one, not a career-ending one, not the dramatic, scorched earth outcome that a different kind of story would require for satisfaction. Just the clean, specific consequence of a documented wrong being officially acknowledged. A conviction, a fine, mandatory anger management, and the particular, lasting damage to a reputation that comes when a public record exists, and anyone who searches Victoria Harmon's name can find it. The restaurant manager who'd stood nearby and done nothing useful was also the subject of a complaint to the Tennessee Department of Labor, which opened an investigation into Rosewood Diner's treatment of customers. The investigation found what investigations generally find when they look carefully at places that have been operating under the assumption that certain customers don't matter. A pattern, not just an incident. Rosewood Diner closed 6 months later. Not because of us specifically, but because the kind of attention that comes with that kind of investigation tends to find other things, and the other things it found in Rosewood's case were sufficient. Victoria Harmon's CEO position at her restaurant group survived the conviction, technically. She retained her title. But Nashville's business community, which had watched the whole thing unfold with the particular attention of a small city's professional class, adjusted itself around her in the way communities adjust around people who have been publicly revealed to be something other than what everyone had assumed. Certain board invitations stopped coming. Certain events became less available to her. The specific social infrastructure that she'd spent years building, and that had given her the comfortable certainty that people like Sandra Mills had no recourse against people like her, quietly began to withdraw. I didn't track any of this carefully at the time. I had other things to attend to. I had a DNA test to take, an attorney to find, a will to read, 3 brothers to begin, slowly and imperfectly, to know. A son who needed the situation explained to him in terms appropriate for a 7-year-old, which turned out to be surprisingly straightforward. Tyler listened to my carefully age-appropriate version of the story, asked 2 clarifying questions, and then said, with characteristic directness, "So we have more family now?" "Yes," I said, "we have more family now." He thought about this for a moment. "Is that okay?" I thought about my mother, who had raised me alone in a city where the man who was supposed to stand beside her had chosen not to. I thought about 40 years of a photograph in a desk drawer, and a dying man's request, and 3 months of searching, and a sidewalk in front of a diner where something had ended and something else had, entirely unexpectedly, begun. "Yeah, baby," I said. "I think it's okay." The DNA results came back on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after that Tuesday evening. I was at home between shifts when the email arrived, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee I'd made and forgotten about, going through Tyler's school folder the way I did every Thursday, signing permission slips and reading newsletters and doing the small administrative work of being a parent. The email notification appeared on my phone screen, and I set down the newsletter about the upcoming science fair and picked up the phone and opened it. The results were exactly what David had told me they would be. Paternal lineage confirmed. Half-siblings with a confidence level that the testing company described as conclusive. I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the table and picked up my cold coffee and drank some of it and looked out the window at the parking lot for a while. I'm not going to tell you it felt the way you might expect it to feel. The dramatic resolution of a lifelong question. The clean, emotional landing of a missing piece falling into place. It didn't feel like that. It felt like something enormous and quiet arriving in an ordinary kitchen on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, too large for the room it was in, requiring more time than I had available to properly sit with. What I felt sitting with it was something for my mother. She had known his name. She had known it the entire time I was growing up, asking my careful questions and watching her navigate around the answers. And she had protected me from it in the specific way she protected me from everything that would have cost me more than I could afford to pay at the age I was paying it. She had raised me to be exactly sufficient for my own life, which is the hardest and most complete thing a parent can do. And she had done it without telling me that the sufficiency was a response to an absence that had a specific name and face and address in this city we both lived in. I thought about what she would have made of all of this. My mother was a practical woman in the way that people become practical when practicality is what survival requires. But she was also, underneath the practicality, someone who believed in the rightness of things eventually coming right. Not passively. She wasn't a wait-and-see woman. She was a work and make it kind. But she had a fundamental faith in the long arc of things that I'd absorbed from her without quite realizing it, and I thought she would have found something satisfying in the specific shape of what had happened. Not the money. She wouldn't have cared about the money for its own sake. She'd raised me to understand that money was a tool and not a destination, and she'd meant it in the way people mean things when they've lived it, rather than just said it. But the being found, the being looked for, the fact that the man who'd made a 22-year-old's choice had spent 40 years knowing he'd made it and had, in the end, asked his sons to find the daughter he'd never met. I thought she would have found something in that worth acknowledging, even while acknowledging everything it wasn't. I called David that afternoon. The attorney process took several months. These things always do, and I'd found my own counsel, a woman named Patricia Graves, who specialized in estate law, and who had the particular quality I required in a lawyer, which was that she told me what things actually meant rather than what they technically said. Patricia reviewed the will, reviewed the estate documentation, reviewed the proposed distribution structure that the Harmon family's attorneys had prepared, and came back to me with a clear, specific picture of what I was looking at. I'm not going to tell you the number, because the number isn't the point of this story and never was. What I'll tell you is that it was real, that it was significant, and that it was equal to David's share, equal to Charles's and Robert's, because that was what Harold Harmon Sr. had written into his will, with the particular belated decisiveness of a man who had spent 40 years being a coward about something and was determined, in the last document he'd ever sign, not to be a coward about it. The first thing I did, the morning after Patricia told me the distribution had cleared, was call the hospital and give my notice. Not because I was done with nursing. I want to be clear about that, because I think it's important. I gave my notice because I was done with the specific version of nursing I'd been doing. The 3 nights a week plus pickups version. The version driven entirely by the financial geometry of keeping the electricity on. And Tyler's field trips paid. And nothing left over at the end of the month. I gave my notice because I'd earned the right to choose the version of the work I actually wanted to do, rather than the version the situation required. I went back 6 months later, part-time, in a pediatric unit I'd always wanted to work in, at hours that allowed me to be home when Tyler got off the school bus. I took a significant pay cut from my previous salary and didn't notice. Tyler's school changed. Not because I moved him precipitously. I was careful about that, careful about disrupting the life he knew in ways that weren't necessary, but because the school he'd been attending was limited in the ways that schools are limited when they're underfunded, and when I had the ability to change that, I did. He went to a new school in the fall, the kind with the resources to actually meet the specific, curious, careful attention brain he had, and I watched him in the first week of it the way you watch something that's been given enough room to be fully what it is. He thrived. Of course he did. David and his brothers became, gradually and imperfectly, what they'd said they wanted to be: family. Not the easy kind, not the kind that arrives fully formed with 40 years of shared history, but the built kind, which is in some ways harder and in some ways more solid for being harder. Sunday dinners, occasionally. Tyler learned Charles's sons' names, which took some time because there were 3 of them, and they were close in age. Robert, who was quieter than his brothers, sent Tyler a book about architecture on his birthday, with a note that said simply, "Your mother told me you like to understand how things work. This might help." Tyler read it 3 times. The thing about new family, the thing I didn't expect, is that it doesn't replace the absence. I want to be honest about that, because I think the version of this story where the absence is simply filled by what comes after it would be dishonest about something important. The absence remains. My mother raised me alone in this city because a young man made a choice, and that's a fact that doesn't change because the young man's sons found me on a sidewalk 60 years later. I carry that fact, and I'll always carry it. And I've made my peace with carrying it without requiring it to be different than it is. What I've found in the year since that Tuesday evening is that carrying a fact and being defined by it are different things. I carried the absence my whole life without being defined by it. My mother made sure of that, with the specific, determined love of a woman who understood exactly what she was building and built it on purpose. What's different now is that I carry it with more people alongside me. Not people who fix it, not people who make it not have happened. Just people who know about it, who've looked at it honestly, who are willing to sit with the complicated truth of what their father did and what it cost and not look away from either part. That's not nothing. In my experience, that's almost everything. About 2 months after everything settled, after the attorneys and the DNA results and the first awkward Sunday dinner, with 3 brothers I was still learning how to be in a room with, Tyler asked me something I hadn't expected. We were in the kitchen on a Saturday morning, the unhurried kind we'd started having more of, The kind where breakfast wasn't something I assembled in 9 minutes before a shift, but something we actually made together. Tyler on the step stool he still needed to reach the counter comfortably. Me beside him, both of us in our pajamas, the particular morning quiet of an apartment that didn't have anywhere to be. He was cracking eggs, which he'd decided was his responsibility, and performed with the focused seriousness of a surgeon, and I was making toast, and the radio was on low, and everything was ordinary in the specific way that things become ordinary after they've been extraordinary. Not forgetting what happened. Just absorbing it into the fabric of a regular Saturday. "Mama," Tyler said, without looking up from the egg he was negotiating over the bowl, "do you wish he'd found us sooner?" I knew immediately who he meant. We'd talked about Harold Harmon Sr. several times since that Tuesday, carefully, in the age-appropriate increments that a 7-year-old can absorb without being overwhelmed, each conversation building on the last. Tyler had processed it with characteristic thoroughness, asking questions that were sometimes simple and sometimes startlingly precise, filing the answers somewhere internal and returning to them occasionally when something new occurred to him. I thought about his question seriously, because he deserved the serious version of my answer. "Yes and no," I said. He looked up at me then, weighing whether that was a real answer or a parental deflection. He had a reliable instinct for the difference. "The yes part," I said, "is that your grandmother didn't get to know any of this. She died not knowing that anyone had looked for us, or wanted to find us, or felt any kind of way about the choice that was made when I was born. And I wish she'd had that. Not the money, not the family, just the knowledge that it hadn't been nothing to him. I think she deserved to know that." Tyler nodded slowly, the egg momentarily forgotten. "And the no part?" I leaned against the counter and looked at my son. 8 years old now. Just turned, growing out of his church clothes again, still wearing the second-hand digital watch he'd gotten for Christmas, and would probably wear until it stopped working entirely, because that was how he was about things he'd decided mattered. "The no part," I said, "is that everything that happened made us exactly who we are. The night shifts, the 2-bedroom apartment, the 3 weeks of saved lunch money." I paused, and he looked at the table where the envelopes had sat that evening, and something moved across his face that was too complex for a word. "All of it made you. And I wouldn't change you for anything in the world, Tyler. Not one thing." He was quiet for a moment, thinking it through the way he thought everything through, completely, without hurrying. "I wouldn't change me either," he said finally, with the straightforward self-possession of a child who has been raised to understand his own worth without needing external confirmation of it. "But I'm glad we have more people now." "Me too," I said. He went back to the egg. I went back to the toast. The radio played something neither of us was listening to, and the morning sat around us warm and unhurried, and I thought about my mother standing at a counter like this one, in a kitchen like this one, making breakfast for a daughter alone in a city where the man who should have been standing beside her had chosen not to be. She had built something complete from incomplete materials. She had done it without complaint, without self-pity, without ever once letting me feel the weight of the absence as something that defined us rather than something we carried. And what she'd built had been sufficient. More than sufficient, fully sufficient, the kind of sufficient that doesn't require anything added to it to be complete. What had been added was not a correction of what she'd built. It was an addition to it. A later chapter in a story that she had started and that I was continuing, and that Tyler would continue after me, in ways neither of us could see yet. I thought about that a lot, in those months, was about continuity, about what gets passed down, about the specific things my mother had given me that I was giving Tyler, the practicality, the refusal to be defined by what's been withheld from you, The particular stubbornness of a woman who knows her own worth and declines to let anyone else's assessment of it stand uncorrected. Tyler had that stubbornness. He'd had it from the beginning before any of this, when he was a 7-year-old in church clothes, holding a door open for his mother at a restaurant he'd saved 3 weeks of lunch money to take her to. That was who he already was. Everything that happened after was simply the world finally catching up to him. There was a Sunday, maybe 3 months after everything settled, when David and his brothers came to our apartment for dinner for the first time. Not a restaurant, not a private room, but our actual apartment, our actual table, the 2-bedroom place in the transitional neighborhood that Tyler had grown up in, and that I had no particular interest in apologizing for to anyone. I cooked. Nothing elaborate. The things I actually cooked well, the recipes my mother had taught me, the food that tasted like a Saturday morning in a small kitchen with the radio on low. David arrived first and stood in the doorway, looking at the apartment with an expression that told me he was doing what people do when they're trying to reconcile the version of a place with the version of a person they've been building in their mind. "It's a good apartment," he said. "It is," I agreed. "Come in." Charles brought wine. Robert brought a book for Tyler. He kept doing this, bringing Tyler books, and Tyler kept reading them, and the two of them had developed a quiet, particular rapport around this exchange that required very little conversation and seemed to suit them both. David helped set the table without being asked, which told me something useful about him. We ate at my kitchen table, the same table where Tyler had presented his business proposal about the birthday dinner, the same table where I'd read the DNA results on a Thursday afternoon with a cold cup of coffee, and it was awkward in the specific way that new family dinners are awkward, with too much care taken over certain subjects and not enough care taken over others, with laughter that arrived slightly late and silence that lasted slightly long. It was also underneath the awkwardness real. 4 people at a table. 5, counting Tyler, who was the least awkward person present by a significant margin, genuinely trying to be something to each other that they hadn't been before, because a man who'd spent 40 years being a coward about something had asked them to try. Tyler sat between David and Robert and talked about his new school with the comprehensive detail he brought to things he cared about. And I watched my brothers. I was starting to be able to use that word internally without it feeling strange. Listen to him with the complete attention of people who understood they were being given access to something worth paying attention to. After dinner, after the dishes were done, and Charles and Robert had said their goodbyes, and Tyler had fallen asleep on the couch in the unconscious way of children who've had a full day, David and I sat at the kitchen table with the last of the wine and the quiet that settles into a place after a lot of people have been in it. "He's extraordinary," David said, about Tyler. Just that, simply. "I know," I said. "You did that," he said. "Whatever my father left you, whatever any of this turns out to mean, you did that first. On your own. I want you to know that I know that." I looked at this man across my kitchen table. My brother, the word was becoming more natural, and thought about everything it had taken to get from Louise Mills's kitchen to this one, and about all the women who had stood in kitchens doing the invisible work of building people who turned out to be worth building. "Your father left me something real," I said. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I was already here. Tyler was already who he is. That part didn't need anything added to it." "No," David agreed. "It didn't." We finished the wine in a comfortable quiet, the kind that takes a while to build between people who are still new to each other. And that means something specific when it arrives. That the work of being in a room together has gotten easier. That the distance is shortening in the gradual, real way that distances shorten between people who keep showing up. I thought about my mother the way I thought about her often now, in a different register than before. Not with the particular ache of something unresolved, but with the quieter, more settled feeling of someone you've been carrying for a long time and have finally found the right way to carry. She would have had opinions about David, I thought. Strong ones, delivered with characteristic directness, probably over coffee at this very table. She would have made him earn his place in the room, not to be cruel, but because that was how she was about things that mattered. You showed her. You didn't just tell her. I thought he would have been willing to do that. I thought, given enough Sunday dinners, she might have let him. I carried that thought like something valuable, set it carefully in the place where I kept things worth keeping, and looked around my kitchen. The kitchen Tyler had grown up in. The kitchen where the birthday envelope had sat on the table. The kitchen where a Thursday afternoon had changed the shape of our life. And felt, with the complete, unhurried certainty of someone who has arrived somewhere after a long walk, that we were exactly where we were supposed to be. Clonun. I've thought a lot, in the year since that Tuesday evening, about what actually happened in that diner. Not the legal part, not the conviction, not the closed restaurant, not the social consequences that followed Victoria Harmon through Nashville's professional circles, like a shadow she couldn't quite shake. Those things happened, and they were the appropriate consequences of a documented wrong, and I don't spend much time thinking about them. What I think about is the specific geometry of that room, the way it was organized, who was visible in it, and who wasn't, and why. Victoria Harmon walked into Rosewood Diner that Tuesday and saw, at a booth by the window, a black woman in an old dress and a small boy in church clothes, with a plain white envelope on the table between them. She performed an assessment. Rapid, confident, entirely unconscious, in the way that these assessments are almost always unconscious, and that assessment told her something specific about the amount of space those two people were entitled to take up in her evening. She was wrong. She was wrong in the specific, documentable way that became a matter of public record. But I've thought about this. She would have been wrong even if 3 Rolls Royces had never pulled up to that curb. She would have been wrong even if my father had never existed, even if there had been no will, no brothers, no DNA results, no inheritance. She would have been wrong simply because my son and I were 2 human beings who had come to a restaurant for a birthday dinner, and that was sufficient reason to be treated with basic decency. The inheritance didn't make us worth treating well. We were already worth treating well. That's the thing I keep coming back to, and I think it's the most important thing in this entire story. Not the money, not the family, not the specific consequence that came from those 3 cars pulling up at the right moment. The most important thing is that none of what followed changed the fundamental wrongness of what happened in that diner. It just changed the consequences. And I think about all the versions of that evening that happen every day in restaurants and offices and parking lots and sidewalks across this country. In the identical version where the 3 cars don't show up, where it's just a woman in an old dress and her son on a sidewalk. And there's no visible recourse, and the world simply continues to be organized the way it was organized before, with the same people taking up the same space and the same people being assessed and found insufficient. Those women are not insufficient. Those children are not less than. The absence of 3 Rolls Royces does not change what they deserve. I think about my mother, who navigated a version of that geometry every day of her life in this city, without the intervention of anything dramatic, without a story that resolved itself visibly. She was assessed and found insufficient by people who didn't know her and didn't try to, and she built a complete, sufficient life anyway, entirely on her own terms, because that was the only option available to her, and she was not someone who used the unavailability of better options as an excuse to accept worse ones. She never got to see Victoria Harmon's conviction. She never got to sit at a table with 3 men who looked for her daughter for 3 months because a dying man asked them to. She never got any of the visible resolution that I got, standing on a Nashville sidewalk in March with my son's hand in mine. She deserved all of it. She deserved it more than I did, and she never got any of it, and that's a fact I carry without being able to resolve it. Because some things don't resolve, they just become part of the weight you carry and learn to carry well. What I've come to understand in the year of carrying all of this is something about visibility and worth that I think I always knew intellectually, but now understand in my body. The way you understand things that have actually happened to you. Worth is not conferred by wealth. It's not conferred by family connections or inheritance or the arrival of 3 luxury cars at an opportune moment. It exists independent of all of those things, in the specific, inalienable fact of a person's humanity. In the 7-year-old who saved his lunch money for 3 weeks and held a door open for his mother. In the woman who worked night shifts for 6 years and never once let her son feel the weight of what it cost her. In the 19-year-old who was left alone in this city and built something complete and sufficient from what she had, which was considerable, even when it wasn't visible to the people who only knew how to see the visible kind. I think about the specific people who are invisible in the rooms they occupy every day. The nurses on the night shift, the servers who bring the food, the women in their best old clothes at the booth by the window. And I think about how rarely the geometry of those rooms accounts for who they actually are, what they've actually built, what they actually carry. I was lucky. I want to say that simply and honestly, the way I said it to David when he told me I'd done something remarkable on my own. I was lucky in the specific, concrete way of a woman whose story resolved visibly, whose worth became legible to the people who'd overlooked it through a mechanism that forced them to look again. Most people don't get that. Most people do the work and carry the weight and build the complete, sufficient lives and are never once seen clearly by the people who looked at them and found them insufficient. They are not insufficient. The assessment was always wrong. It was drool before the cars. It will be wrong tomorrow, in rooms that don't have anyone arriving to correct it. I think the only honest response to understanding that, the only response that's worthy of my mother, and of the 6 years I spent being invisible in rooms that didn't account for what I actually was, is to be the person who looks more carefully, who asks the question before forming the assessment, who understands that the envelope on the table is not an indicator of the person sitting behind it, but of the love they put into getting there. Tyler understands this already. He understood it before any of this happened in the pure, uncomplicated way of children who haven't yet been taught to assess people by their visible markers. He held the door open for his mother because she was his mother, because she deserved a held door, because that was simply and obviously the right thing to do, not because of who her father turned out to be, or what her bank account eventually contained. That's the version of seeing clearly I'm trying to learn, at 35, from a child who arrived at it, naturally at 7. It shouldn't be that hard. It only requires looking at the person in front of you and understanding, before anything else, that they are a person, complete, sufficient, worth the door being held. That's all it takes. That's all it ever took. Tyler turned 8 in March, 1 year after the birthday dinner that changed everything. We went back to a diner for his birthday. Not Rosewood, a different place, smaller, family-owned, the kind with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, and a woman behind the counter who knew her regulars by name and made you feel, the moment you walked in, like you were one of them. Tyler wore his church clothes again. The new ones, which fit properly now, because fitting properly was something we could manage without math anymore. He still brought an envelope. Not because he needed to, but because he decided it was a birthday tradition, and Tyler, once he decided something was a tradition, was not easily redirected. This time the envelope had a card inside it. He'd made it himself, construction paper and markers, the way he made everything he considered important. On the front he'd drawn the two of us, stick figures with remarkable attention to detail, my scrubs, his watch, both of us with our hands out to each other the way we always walked. On the inside he'd written, in his careful second-grade handwriting, "Thank you for always being enough, Mama. Love, Tyler." I read it at the table and did not cry, which required more effort than I will admit. We had the chicken and waffles, his the spicy version again, a confirmed tradition now, and we talked about school and the book Robert had sent him, and the science fair project he'd been developing with the focused intensity he brought to anything that interested him. He told me, with great seriousness, that he decided he wanted to be an architect. Not because of the book, he clarified, but because of what the book had made him understand about how things were built, and how the building of them was itself a kind of thinking. I thought about Robert, who had sent a book to a child he barely knew because a woman he'd just met had mentioned. Her son liked to understand how things worked. I thought about the specific, quiet ways that new family makes itself felt. Not on dramatic gestures, not in the visible currency of wealth and names, but in small chosen acts of attention, in books sent and dinners attended, and the gradual real accumulation of being present for someone. I thought about my mother, who had been present for me every single day of my life without any of the visible markers, and who had given me something no inheritance could replicate or supplement: the bone-deep understanding that I was worth showing up for. I pass that forward every day. It's the only inheritance that matters, in the end. After dinner, walking back to the car in the March evening, Tyler took my hand the way he had on that sidewalk a year ago, both hands around one of mine, a gesture he'd carried forward from babyhood into second grade without seeming to notice, and that I had never once corrected because I would let him hold my hand that way until he was 40 if he wanted to. "Mama," he said, "do you think next year we could invite David and them to my birthday?" I looked down at my son in the March evening, in his properly fitting church clothes, with his birthday envelope, suggesting casually that we expand our birthday table to include the 3 brothers we'd acquired on a sidewalk in circumstances neither of us had anticipated. "Yeah," I said. "I think that would be good." He nodded, satisfied, and we walked to the car in the particular quiet of a birthday evening, going exactly the way it was supposed to go. No drama, no intervention required. Just a woman and her son on a Nashville street, complete and sufficient, heading home. If this story stayed with you, if any part of it felt familiar or necessary or like something you needed to hear, I'd love for you to tell me what it was. Subscribe if you're new here, because there are more of these, and drop a comment below. Has there ever been a moment when the world finally saw you clearly, after a long time of not looking? Or a moment when you realized you'd been the one doing the not looking? I read every comment, and I'll see you in the next one.